In the autumn of 1415, on a rain-soaked field in northern France, the impossible was about to unfold. 20,000 French knights, the flower of European chivalry, stood poised to crush what seemed like a ragged band of English invaders. Yet by the day's end, the mud would run red with noble blood, and a young English king would carve his name into legend with nothing but arrows, stakes, and sheer audacity. This is the story of Agincourt, where Henry V turned disaster into triumph and changed the course of medieval warfare forever. The year 1415 found Europe locked in the grinding struggle known as the 100 Years' War. For decades, English and French armies had clashed across the countryside, each claiming dominion over lands that had changed hands more times than anyone could count. At the heart of this conflict stood a bold young monarch, Henry V of England, barely 28 years old but burning with ambition that matched his father's crown. Henry's claim to the French throne stretched back generations, rooted in the tangled bloodlines of medieval royalty. Through his great-grandfather Edward III, he believed himself the rightful king of France, though in practice, such claims often served as bargaining chips in the endless game of medieval diplomacy. The French, naturally, saw things differently. To them, Henry was nothing more than an upstart invader, another English king drunk on impossible dreams of conquest. By the spring of 1414, Henry had grown tired of diplomatic games. He called together his great council, the most powerful lords of England, and laid bare his intentions. War with France was coming. Yet even his own nobles urged caution, insisting he moderate his demands and seek further negotiation. Henry listened, but his mind was already made. If diplomacy would not secure his inheritance, then steel would have to suffice. The negotiations that followed were a masterclass in medieval brinkmanship. Henry's demands were staggering. He wanted not merely recognition of his claim to the French crown, but the immediate payment of 1.6 million crowns, the outstanding ransom from King John II, who had been captured at the Battle of Poitiers decades earlier. He demanded the return of all English territories in France, along with the hand of Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter, in marriage. To sweeten this bitter pill, he offered to renounce his claim to the French throne entirely, if only these terms were met. The French response was predictably cold. They would not pay ransom money for a king long dead. They would not surrender vast territories to an English adventurer, and they certainly would not hand over their princess to seal such a humiliating bargain. Diplomacy had reached its end. Henry began preparing for war. The preparations were unlike anything England had seen in a generation. Ships were commandeered from every port along the southern coast. Weapons were forged in countless smithies, their hammers ringing day and night. Archers were summoned from the Welsh valleys and English shires, men whose fathers and grandfathers had won glory at Crécy and Poitiers with their mighty longbows. By summer's end, Henry had assembled a force of some 12,000 men, along with 20,000 horses to carry them and their supplies across the Channel. On August 13th, 1415, this mighty armada set sail from Southampton. Contemporary chroniclers claimed the fleet numbered 1,500 ships, though modern historians suspect the true figure was far smaller. Regardless, it was an impressive sight. The sea bristled with masts and sails as far as the eye could see, carrying not just soldiers but the dreams of a kingdom toward the shores of France. The target was Harfleur, a fortified port at the mouth of the Seine River. Henry's strategy was sound in principle. Capture this vital harbor, secure a base of operations, then march inland to claim his inheritance. What he had not anticipated was how stubbornly the town would resist, nor how cruelly disease would ravage his army during the long weeks of siege. Harfleur's walls were thick and well defended. Its garrison, though outnumbered, fought with the desperation of men defending their homes. Day after day, English cannon and catapults pounded the fortifications, while miners dug tunnels beneath the walls, seeking to collapse them with explosions. The defenders responded in kind, sallying forth to burn the English siege works and raining arrows and stones down upon the attackers. But it was not French steel that proved Henry's greatest enemy. It was disease. The English camp, crowded with men and horses, became a breeding ground for dysentery and fever. Soldiers who had crossed the Channel in perfect health found themselves wasting away, their bodies racked with illness that no amount of courage could overcome. By the time Harfleur finally surrendered on September 22nd, Henry's army had been reduced from 12,000 to barely 9,000 effective men. The campaign season was drawing to a close. Winter storms would soon make the Channel crossing treacherous, if not impossible. Many of Henry's advisors urged him to return to England immediately, claiming victory with the capture of a single port. After all, Harfleur was no small prize. It commanded the mouth of the Seine and could serve as a base for future campaigns. Why risk everything for uncertain gains? But Henry was not a king content with half measures. The expedition had cost a fortune, and he had little to show for it beyond one battered port and a much reduced army. More importantly, returning now would look like retreat, and Henry understood that in the game of medieval kingship, perception was everything. If he slunk back to England with his tail between his legs, his enemies would see weakness. His own nobles might begin to question his fitness to rule. The French would be emboldened, knowing they had bloodied the English without even fighting a proper battle. Instead, Henry made a decision that seemed to border on madness. He would march his depleted army across Normandy to Calais, the English-held port that had served as a gateway to France for nearly 70 years. It was a distance of over 150 miles through hostile territory, with a French army somewhere ahead, gathering strength and thirsting for revenge. The march began on October 8th. Henry's force had been winnowed down to perhaps 1,000 knights and men-at-arms, supported by 5,000 archers. They were tired, many still weakened by disease, and they carried supplies for only 8 days. It was a desperate gamble, but Henry believed speed and audacity might see them through, where caution would only invite disaster. For the first few days, the march proceeded without serious incident. French scouts shadowed the English column, but no major force appeared to block their path. Henry's men began to hope they might reach Calais unmolested. That hope proved tragically premature. The Somme River, which they had expected to cross easily, was heavily defended. French engineers had destroyed the bridges and stationed troops at every ford. What should have been a simple river crossing became a strategic nightmare that would force Henry to march his army far upstream, burning precious time and supplies while allowing the French to concentrate their forces. Meanwhile, across the rain-soaked fields of northern France, the flower of French chivalry was gathering for what many believed would be the final act of this English adventure. Charles d'Albret, Constable of France, commanded a host that swelled with every passing day. Nobles arrived with their retinues from across the kingdom, eager to win glory in what seemed certain to be a one-sided slaughter. By the time Henry's exhausted army finally managed to cross the Somme, the French force waiting for them numbered at least 15,000 men, perhaps as many as 20,000. The stage was set for one of the most improbable confrontations in medieval history. A young English king, far from home with a handful of sick and tired soldiers, was about to face the assembled might of French chivalry on ground of their choosing. On October 24th, as evening shadows stretched across the French countryside, Henry's scouts brought word that chilled the blood of even his most seasoned veterans. The French army had been sighted, and it was vast beyond imagination. Banners stretched across the horizon like a sea of silk and gold, each one representing a noble house with centuries of martial tradition. The very earth seemed to tremble under the weight of so many armored men and their destriers. That night, the two armies camped within sight of each other near the village of Agincourt. The contrast could not have been starker. The French camp blazed with countless fires, their light reflecting off polished armor and jeweled weapons. Laughter and boasting echoed through the night as nobles wagered on who would capture the English king come morning. Wine flowed freely as they celebrated a victory they considered already won. The English camp told a different story. Henry's men huddled around smaller fires, their faces gaunt from weeks of hard marching and poor rations. Many still bore the pallor of recent illness. They sharpened weapons with quiet determination, checked bowstrings with practiced hands, and spoke in hushed tones of home and family. These were not men preparing for certain triumph. They were warriors making peace with death. Henry himself moved among his soldiers throughout that long night, offering words of encouragement and sharing their meager rations. Unlike the French nobles who would fight from horseback in gleaming plate armor, the English king planned to stand with his men in the mud, sword in hand. This was no distant commander issuing orders from a pavilion. This was a warrior king who would live or die with his army. As dawn broke on October 25th, the feast day of Saints Crispin and Crispinian, the true scale of French numerical superiority became apparent. Conservative estimates placed their strength at 15,000 men, though some chroniclers claimed it reached 20,000 or more. Against this host, Henry could field barely 7,000 souls, and many of those were weakened by disease and exhaustion. But numbers alone do not win battles, and Henry possessed advantages his enemies had failed to recognize. Chief among these was the English longbow, a weapon that had revolutionized warfare at Crécy and Poitiers, but which the French had stubbornly refused to adopt or adequately counter. Nearly 5,000 of Henry's men carried these devastating weapons, each bow standing as tall as the archer who wielded it. The longbow was no simple hunting weapon. It required a lifetime of training to master, with boys beginning their practice as young as 8 years old. The constant drawing of bows with pulls exceeding 100 pounds developed grotesquely enlarged muscles in the archers' backs and arms, marking them as clearly as any uniform. These men could loose 12 arrows per minute with deadly accuracy, and their bodkin-pointed shafts could pierce mail at ranges approaching 300 yards. The French had encountered English archery before, but they remained confident in their heavy cavalry and superior numbers. Their battle plan was straightforward. Mounted knights would charge the English line, scattering the archers and breaking through to engage the men-at-arms in close combat where French superiority in armor and training would tell. It was a proven tactic that had worked for centuries across European battlefields. What the French had not accounted for was the battlefield itself. Days of steady rain had transformed the newly plowed fields around Agincourt into a treacherous morass. The clay soil, churned by horses and men, became a sucking bog that could trap a fully armored knight up to his knees. Worse still, the field narrowed between two patches of woodland, creating a funnel that would compress the French formations and negate their numerical advantage. Henry, with the eye of a master tactician, recognized the ground's potential immediately. He positioned his army at the narrow end of the field, with the woods protecting his flanks from cavalry attacks. His archers he placed on both wings, protected by sharpened stakes driven into the earth at angles designed to impale charging horses. This was an innovation learned from recent campaigns, an improvement on the pits and caltrops used at earlier battles. The men-at-arms, including Henry himself, took position in the center, 4 ranks deep with shoulders touching. They would serve as the anvil upon which French cavalry would be broken, while the longbowmen provided the hammer blows that would shatter enemy formations before they could close to sword range. As morning mist began to lift from the sodden fields, both armies formed their battle lines. The French deployed in 3 massive divisions, each larger than Henry's entire force. The vanguard, commanded by Charles d'Albret himself, consisted of the finest knights in France, men whose armor alone was worth a king's ransom. Behind them stood 2 more divisions, a reserve of power that seemed to guarantee French victory through sheer weight of numbers. The French were so confident of triumph that they had already begun discussing how to divide the English prisoners and their ransoms. Henry himself would be worth a fortune alive, while his nobles would provide comfortable retirements for their captors. The common soldiers would be killed, of course, but the knights and men-at-arms represented walking treasuries, waiting to be claimed. For hours, the 2 armies stared at each other across the muddy field. The French seemed content to wait, perhaps hoping the English would grow desperate and attack first, charging across the killing ground into the teeth of superior numbers. But Henry was far too clever for such a trap. Instead, he played a waiting game of his own, knowing that time favored neither side but that French pride might eventually force their hand. The breakthrough came when Henry made a decision that stunned both armies. Rather than wait for the French attack, he ordered his entire force to advance. The longbowmen pulled up their protective stakes, carried them forward, and replanted them within optimal range of the enemy formations. It was a move of breathtaking audacity, bringing his smaller force closer to an enemy that could crush them through sheer numbers alone. But Henry had calculated correctly. The French, seeing the English advance as a sign of desperation, could not resist the opportunity to charge. Their horns sounded across the field, and the flower of French chivalry spurred their destriers forward into what they believed would be a glorious slaughter. Instead, they rode into the most devastating archery display in medieval history. As the French cavalry thundered across the muddy field, 6,000 English and Welsh longbows bent in unison, the air filled with arrows so thick that chroniclers claimed they blotted out the sun itself. Wave after wave of shafts rained down on the advancing knights, striking horses and riders with mechanical precision. The battlefield itself became an ally to the English cause. Horses, maddened by pain and terror, reared and bolted, throwing their riders into the sucking mud. Knights who managed to maintain their seats found their mounts struggling against the treacherous footing, slowing their charge to a stumbling walk. All the while, the arrows continued to fall like deadly hail. The sight that greeted the French as they struggled through the mud was unlike anything in their experience. Knights who had trained since childhood for this moment found themselves trapped in a nightmare of churning clay and whistling death. Their destriers, bred for war but not for this hellish terrain, floundered and fell, crushing riders beneath tons of armored horseflesh. The carefully ordered charge that was meant to sweep the English from the field dissolved into chaos before it had traveled half the distance. Those knights who managed to reach the English stakes discovered that their ordeal had only begun. The sharpened posts, angled perfectly to catch charging horses, turned the battlefield into a deadly obstacle course. Mounts reared and screamed as they impaled themselves on the wooden points, throwing their riders to the ground where they lay, stunned and vulnerable. The few who made it past this barrier found themselves face to face with English men-at-arms who had been waiting for this moment with grim determination. But it was the archers who truly turned the tide. As the initial cavalry charge faltered and fell back, the longbowmen continued their relentless bombardment. Arrow after arrow found its mark, striking down nobles whose names had been legendary throughout Europe. The bodkin points, designed specifically for piercing mail and plate, punched through armor that had taken master craftsmen months to forge. French knights who had considered themselves invincible discovered that English yew could humble the proudest warrior. The retreat of the first French line created a catastrophe that no one had anticipated. The wounded and panicking horses galloped back through the ranks of advancing infantry, scattering men who had been marching forward in perfect order. Foot soldiers found themselves trampled by the very cavalry they had come to support. The careful battle plan that French commanders had devised collapsed into confusion as their own retreating forces became weapons against them. Yet the French were far from finished. The second line, seeing the fate of their comrades, pressed forward with renewed determination. These were veteran warriors who had fought in countless battles, and they would not be deterred by a single repulse. They advanced on foot this time, having learned from the cavalry's mistake. Heavily armored men-at-arms slogged through the mud with grim purpose, their great swords and battle-axes gleaming despite the grey morning light. The English archers, seeing the enemy approach within killing range, abandoned their longbows and drew the swords and daggers that hung at their belts. These were not the jeweled weapons of nobility, but honest steel meant for butcher's work. Alongside the men-at-arms, they formed a line of determination that stretched across the narrow field. What followed was not the chivalrous combat of tournament and song, but a brutal melee where survival mattered more than honor. The fighting was unlike anything medieval warfare had seen before. Knights who had trained to fight mounted found themselves struggling in knee-deep mud against opponents who had nothing to lose. The French, weighed down by their heavy armor, moved like men underwater while the lighter-equipped English darted around them like deadly shadows. Poleaxes and warhammers rose and fell with sickening regularity, crushing helmets and splitting shields in a symphony of destruction. Henry himself fought in the thick of the combat, his royal surcoat marking him as a target for every French warrior who could reach him. More than once, enemy weapons came close to ending the English cause with a single blow, but the king's household knights surrounded him like a living wall, their own lives forfeit if harm came to their sovereign. They fought with the fury of men defending not just their king, but their very reason for existing. The mud itself became a weapon in this struggle. French knights, once knocked down, found it nearly impossible to rise again. The weight of their armor, designed to protect them in mounted combat, became a death sentence in the sucking clay. Some drowned in their own helmets as water and mud filled the breathing holes. Others lay helpless as English daggers found the joints in their harness, ending lives that had cost fortunes to equip and train. As the morning wore on, the tide of battle became clear. The French second line, despite their courage and determination, could not overcome the combination of terrain, English archery, and sheer tactical superiority. They fell back in disorder, leaving hundreds of their comrades dead or dying in the churned earth. The field that had been green meadow at dawn was now a brown wasteland littered with the debris of war. But the battle was far from over. The French third line, larger than the previous two combined, still waited beyond the killing ground. These were fresh troops who had watched their comrades' destruction with growing anger and determination. They would not make the same mistakes as those who had gone before. They would advance slowly, methodically, using their overwhelming numbers to simply crush the English through sheer weight. It was at this moment that disaster struck from an unexpected quarter. A band of French peasants and men-at-arms, led by local nobles, had crept around the battle lines to attack the English baggage train. Their goal was simple plunder, the gold and silver that traveling armies always carried, but their timing could not have been worse. Henry, seeing armed Frenchmen in his rear, believed this was a coordinated attack designed to trap his army between two forces. The king, who had shown mercy to prisoners throughout the campaign, now faced what seemed like annihilation. His decision was swift and brutal. Every French prisoner taken during the morning's fighting was to be executed immediately. It was a harsh command that violated the customs of chivalrous warfare, but Henry was fighting for survival, not glory. The execution of the prisoners sent shockwaves through both armies. For the French, it meant that hundreds of their finest nobles died, not in glorious combat, but as helpless captives. For the English, it meant that any hope of ransoming their captives for the wealth that might have made them rich was lost forever. But it also sent a clear message. Henry would not be taken alive, and he would show no mercy to those who threatened his army's survival. The threat from the baggage train proved to be minor, quickly dispersed by English camp followers and servants. But the damage was done. French morale, already shaken by the morning's disasters, cracked completely when word spread of the prisoners' fate. The third line, which had seemed so formidable moments before, began to waver and break apart without ever engaging the enemy. What had begun as certain French victory had transformed into utter catastrophe. The flower of French nobility lay dead in the mud of Agincourt, their blood mixing with the clay to create a crimson paste that would stain the field for months to come. The survivors, those few who could still walk or ride, began the long retreat toward Paris, carrying with them news that would shake the foundations of the French kingdom. Henry stood among the wreckage of his enemy's hopes, his own survival nothing short of miraculous. The young king, who had gambled everything on a desperate march across hostile territory, had won one of the most complete victories in military history. But as he surveyed the carnage around him, he understood that this was more than just a battle won. This was the moment when the old certainties of medieval warfare died in the mud alongside French chivalry. The longbow had proven itself the master of the mounted knight. Common archers had brought down nobles whose lineages stretched back to Charlemagne. The careful tactics of a determined king had overcome odds that should have been insurmountable. The world would never be quite the same again. As evening shadows began to fall across the field of Agincourt, the magnitude of what had occurred became clear to both victor and vanquished. The French had lost not just a battle, but a generation of leadership that could never be replaced. The English had gained more than victory. They had won a legend that would inspire their nation for centuries to come. The mud of Agincourt had claimed its harvest. 6,000 French nobles lay dead in the churned clay, while English losses numbered fewer than 100 souls. Against impossible odds, Henry V had transformed certain defeat into legendary triumph through tactical brilliance, superior weaponry, and the unforgiving terrain itself. This was more than victory. It was the moment medieval warfare changed forever, proving that courage, strategy, and a handful of longbows could topple empires and reshape the destiny of nations.